I'm Dave Anderson. In this video, I'll review the various types of production costs and the associated graphs. A fixed cost is a cost that does not change as the firm produces more units of output. For example, as a firm increases its output in the short run, it doesn't spend more on machinery or rent for its buildings because the firm can only change those things in the long run after current contracts expire and there is time to build more buildings or modify the production line. A variable cost is a cost that does change as more units are made. When a firm increases its output, it spends more on things like labor and electricity. Total cost is variable cost plus fixed cost. The averages of each of these types of cost are important as well. To find the average of anything, we take the total and divide by the quantity. So the average fixed cost is the total fixed cost divided by the quantity of output. The average variable cost is the total variable cost divided by the quantity of output. And the average total cost is the total cost divided by the quantity of output. One more type of production cost is very important, the marginal cost. The marginal cost is the additional cost of making one more unit. We can find that as the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Let's look at how these costs appear on a graph, starting with the marginal cost because that determines several of the other types of cost. This is a common shape for the marginal cost curve. We can explain this shape by looking at what happens to the quantity of output as the amount of a variable input such as labor increases. For this example, we'll think of a unit of labor as being 1 worker per hour. As a firm adds more workers to the production process, initially each new worker adds more to output than the previous worker. We can show this on a graph of the marginal product of labor, which shows the increase in output resulting from each new worker. This increasing marginal product is possible because an increase in the number of workers allows workers to specialize in particular tasks and improve their productivity. At some point, however, the opportunities for specialization run out, and congestion and redundancy cause the marginal product to decrease. The law of diminishing marginal returns states that as you add more of a variable input to fixed quantities of another input, the marginal product of the variable input eventually diminishes. Now consider what happens to the marginal cost as the marginal product of labor increases and decreases. As the marginal product of labor increases, that is, with each worker adding more to output than the previous worker, the increased productivity means that it costs less to make another unit, so the marginal cost decreases. As the marginal product of labor decreases and each worker adds less to output than the previous worker, the decreasing productivity means it costs more to make another unit, so the marginal cost increases. That is, the marginal cost curve does the opposite of what the marginal product curve does. To reinforce this important but often forgotten reason for the shape of the marginal cost curve, I've gone to the opposite side of the world where they drive on the opposite side of the car on the opposite side of the road to remind you to think of the opposite of what happens to marginal product to explain the shape of the marginal cost curve. Next, we'll think about the relationship between the marginal cost curve and the average variable cost and average total cost curves. Suppose your class had weekly quizzes. If your quiz average were 80 and your score on the next quiz were lower than 80, say 70, what would happen to your average? The lower quiz score would pull the average down, and if your score on the next quiz were higher than 80, say 90, the new higher quiz score would pull the average up. The same thing happens with the marginal cost and the average variable cost. If the next or marginal unit costs less than the average variable cost, the lower marginal cost will pull the average variable cost down. And if the marginal cost is more than the average variable cost, the higher marginal cost will pull the average variable cost up. When the marginal cost curve crosses the average variable cost curve, the marginal cost goes from pulling the average variable cost down to pulling it up. So the minimum point of the average variable cost curve is always at its intersection with the marginal cost curve. The average fixed cost does nothing but fall as the quantity increases because the total fixed cost stays the same. So as the quantity increases, that simply brings the average down. The average total cost is the sum of the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. So it begins high because the average fixed cost begins high. It drops with the average fixed cost and average variable cost dropping, and then rises when the increase in the average variable cost is larger than the decrease in the average fixed cost. Like the average variable cost, the average total cost goes from decreasing to increasing when it crosses the marginal cost curve, which pulls it down when the marginal cost is below the average total cost, and pulls it up when the marginal cost is above the average total cost. The total fixed cost is represented by a horizontal line at the level of the fixed cost. The total variable cost rises by the amount of the marginal cost. So when the marginal cost is falling, the total variable cost rises by smaller and smaller amounts. And when the marginal cost is rising, the total variable cost rises by larger and larger amounts. In other words, the marginal cost is the slope of the total variable cost. The total cost is the sum of the total fixed cost and the total variable cost. When the quantity is zero, there is no variable cost, so the total cost is equal to the total fixed cost. At every quantity, the total cost curve is above the total variable cost curve by the amount of the total fixed cost. There are many special cases for cost curves, but if you understand the meaning of the various types of cost, you can handle those special cases. For example, if the marginal cost rises steadily, we know that the average variable cost will rise steadily as well, because the average variable cost is pulled in the direction of the marginal cost. What happens to the average total cost depends on the average fixed cost. If there is no fixed cost, which is the case in the long run when every input is variable, the average variable cost equals the average total cost. Remember these tips and practice drawing the curves, and your quiz scores will rise steadily too.